Scientist of Death, Shirō Ishii, and the darkness of Unit 730, one embarks on an unflinching journey into the life and deeds of one of history's most enigmatic and controversial figures, Shirō Ishii, a man whose name has become synonymous with unimaginable suffering and scientific transgression, remains a shadow looming over 20th century Japanese history as the mastermind behind Unit 731, the notorious biological warfare research and development unit of the Imperial Japanese Army. During the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II, Ishii engineered a program that married cutting-edge science with monstrous acts, leaving scars that have yet to fully heal. This book unfolds the chilling narrative of Ishii's ascension, from his formative years in Meiji-era Japan to his obsessive pursuit of scientific prestige and imperial ambition. It meticulously investigates how Ishii's early curiosity and drive led him down a path where nationalistic fervor, personal ambition, and ethical blindness collided. Through the lens of his medical training and his fascination with microbiology, we see the development of a man whose thirst for experimentation knew no bounds. Each chapter delves deeper into the transformation of a doctor into an architect of horror. The establishment of Unit 731 marked a turning point not only in military tactics, but also in the history of medical ethics, driven by the philosophy of unrestricted human experimentation. Under the guise of scientific advancement, Ishii's regime conducted harrowing experiments on prisoners, men, women, and children subjected to diseases, mutilations, and biological weapons tests. The justification for such atrocities was often couched in the language of progress and national security, a chilling reminder of how science can be twisted for malevolent ends. The book provides unprecedented access to documented evidence, survivor testimonies, and the broader historical context that shaped the era. It scrutinizes the infrastructure and administrative expansion of Unit 731, tracing its influence from initial covert operations to large-scale deployment and its impact on future biological warfare doctrines. Throughout, this work seeks not only to inform, but also to evoke reflection on the moral responsibilities of those who wield the power of science. By unraveling the story of Shirō Ishii and Unit 731, Scientist of Death serves as both a historical record and a warning, a testament to the catastrophic consequences of unchecked ambition and a complex interplay between science, ethics, and authority. The darkness of Unit 731 is not merely a relic of the past, but a lingering challenge to our collective conscience. Chapter 1: Early Life in Japan, Formative Years. Shirō Ishii was born in 1892 in the small village of Shibayama, nestled in the Chiba prefecture of Japan. His early years were defined by the social and political transformation occurring under the Meiji Restoration, a period when Japan rapidly modernized and embraced Western science, education, and culture. Ishii's family belonged to the local gentry, affording him educational opportunities that would prove foundational to his future pursuits. From a young age, Ishii exhibited an insatiable curiosity. Observers remarked on his keen intelligence and restlessness, often finding him exploring local streams, collecting insects, and reading voraciously. His parents, both literate and inclined towards academic achievement, encouraged Shira's intellectual endeavors. The Japanese education system, newly reformed to mirror Western models, facilitated his growth, emphasizing logic, discipline, and loyalty to the nation, a confluence that seeded a sense of duty and ambition in the young Ishii. Attending local schools, Ishii quickly distinguished himself among his peers. Not merely as a bright student, but as a leader and a provocateur. He challenged his instructors, questioned prevailing wisdom, and sought understanding beyond rote memorization. This penchant for challenging norms while being lauded by teachers also set him apart, marking him as an unconventional thinker who thrived under pressure. These formative years coincided with Japan's awakening on the world stage. The country's victory over China in the First Sino-Japanese War, coupled with burgeoning industrialization, fostered national pride. Patriotic fervor saturated the educational system and household conversations alike, instilling a belief in Japan's destiny to lead and innovate. For Ishii, the ideals of strength, progress, and imperial grandeur became intertwined with personal aspiration. Family life played an integral role in shaping Ishii's worldview. His father, a respected community figure, modeled discipline and service. His mother, compassionate yet firm, nurtured his more sensitive qualities while instilling a strong sense of responsibility. The family's adherence to traditional Confucian values, alongside the adoption of modern mores, provided Ishii with a balanced yet dynamic outlook. As he transitioned into adolescence, the future scientist's interests crystallized around the natural sciences. Fascinated by biology and chemistry, he performed experiments with homemade apparatuses, sometimes endangering himself for the sake of discovery. His teachers, recognizing his talent, bestowed additional responsibilities, often allowing him to mentor younger students. By the time he completed middle school, Ishii had resolved to pursue medical studies, a decision supported fervently by his family. But Ishii's formative environment was not solely academic. It was marked by a growing sense of nationalism and militarism. Conscription, military exercises, and tales of battlefield glory permeated youth culture. Ishii, keenly observing the world's rapid shift towards scientific warfare, understood the symbiosis between medicine and military power. His ambitions increasingly mirrored the nation's agenda to harness science as a tool of dominance. In 1911, Ishii matriculated at Kyoto Imperial University, one of Japan's premier institutions. University life further expanded his horizons, exposing him to contemporary scientific theories, international scholars, and advanced laboratory resources. Ishii thrived in this competitive environment, quickly building a reputation for brilliance and eccentricity. He joined academic circles, debated with Western students, and immersed himself in the rigorous study of human physiology and disease. During his university years, Ishii began to exhibit behaviors and attitudes that would later define his career. He displayed an unwavering confidence, bordering on arrogance. He was insistent on his theories and remained doggedly committed to his research, sometimes refusing collaboration or critique. Such traits alienated some classmates, yet drew the attention of professors searching for the next generation of scientific leaders. The socio-political climate during Ishii's formative years cannot be understated. Japan's expansionist ambitions, the growing influence of science and technology in military strategy, and the imperial government's patronage of medical research coalesced to create an environment ripe for exploitation. Ishii absorbed these influences, interpreting them as both a challenge and an opportunity. Upon graduation, Ishii stood at a crossroads of prodigious intellect with a burning desire to serve his nation through science. His formative years in Chiba, the disciplined yet progressive upbringing, and the militaristic nationalism pervasive in his society, had all converged to shape a young man uniquely positioned to impact history. For better or worse, the path ahead would be marked by innovation, ambition, and, ultimately, darkness. Chapter 2: Medical Training and Obsession with Microbiology. Shirō Ishii's medical training was the crucible in which his intellect, ambition, and ethical boundaries would be tested and forged. After enrolling at Kyoto Imperial University's Faculty of Medicine, Ishii immersed himself in the study of anatomy, pathology, and the emerging field of microbiology, a discipline that, at the turn of the 20th century, promised to unlock the mysteries of disease and life itself. The university's environment was intellectually charged and progressive. Western influences dominated the curriculum, with German and French textbooks forming the backbone of medical education. Ishii, a polyglot and a quick learner, excelled in reading technical literature, rapidly assimilating knowledge beyond his years. He honed his laboratory skills, mastering microscopy, culturing techniques, and the complexities of bacteriology. Professors noted his unmatched precision and his willingness to spend countless hours meticulously documenting experiments. It was during these formative years that Ishii's obsession with microbiology truly emerged. Fascinated by the invisible world of bacteria and viruses, he gravitated towards cutting-edge research, eagerly participating in laboratory investigations of infectious disease mechanisms. He became enthralled by the pioneering work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, seeing in their discoveries the potential for both healing and destruction. Ishii's mind ranged beyond the classroom. He began proposing novel hypotheses to mentors, questioning accepted practices, and suggesting alternative approaches to disease modeling. His relentless pursuit of innovation sometimes bordered on the radical. Reportedly, he undertook dangerous self-experimentation, exposing himself to pathogens to observe their effects firsthand, risking his health. For scientific insight, as Ishii's reputation grew, so did his network. He established relationships with influential professors, government officials, and fellow researchers, keenly aware of the strategic advantages that alliances could offer. His correspondence with international scientists, facilitated by the university's exchange programs, exposed him to the global debate on germ theory and biological warfare, a field that, while controversial, was attracting increasing military interest. By the time Ishii entered his clinical rotations, his skills as a researcher were evident, yet he harbored reservations about the limitations of ethical oversight in medical science. In conversations with colleagues, Ishii questioned the universality of Western bioethics, arguing that national imperatives could supersede individual rights in times of crisis. Such views, radical even in the context of Imperial Japan, set the stage for his later disregard for human suffering. Upon graduation with honors, Ishii's academic thesis focused on waterborne pathogens, their mechanisms of transmission, and potential methods of eradication. His work was lauded for its originality and scientific rigor, earning him recommendations for postgraduate research. Ishii was soon appointed to the university's research hospital, where he continued to delve into pathogenesis and immunology. Yet, Ishii's thirst for discovery outpaced conventional academic research. He began experimenting with bacteria's tools of war, theorizing about their utility in battlefield conditions. The concept was not new. European powers had already made headlines with clandestine research into biological agents, but Ishii's approach was methodical and intertwined with patriotic zeal. He advocated for Japanese self-sufficiency in developing biological weapons, framing such research as vital to national survival. His arguments found receptive ears among certain military leaders who saw science as a means of asymmetric warfare. Through private presentations and classified reports, Ishii campaigned for increased government investment in microbiological studies. He outlined experimental protocols, described the military applications of plague, cholera, and anthrax, and proposed mechanisms for mass dissemination. The seeds of Unit 731 were thus sown in these deliberations. Couched in the language of medical progress, during this period, Ishii's personal ethical compass seemingly shifted. Accounts from contemporaries describe his growing detachment from patient care, an increasing fixation on data, and an unwillingness to confront the suffering caused by experimental failure. His justification relied heavily on utilitarian arguments. The greater good of the nation outweighed individual sacrifice. This perspective resonated with a society primed for militarization, but clashed fundamentally with international norms. Sure, Ishii's medical education, then, was more than a pathway to professional qualification. It was a journey into the heart of scientific ambition, marked by brilliance, innovation, and a gradual erosion of ethical restraint. His obsession with microbiology became the lodestar guiding his future endeavors, providing both the technical knowledge and ideological framework that would underpin the darkest chapter of his career. By the time he left Kyoto Imperial University, Ishii was not merely a physician, but a visionary one who saw in science the ultimate weapon, unconstrained by moral boundaries. Chapter 3: Imperial Ambitions. Joining the Japanese military. The transition from academia to military service marked a defining juncture in Shirō Ishii's life. With his academic accolades and expertise in microbiology, Ishii was perfectly poised to catch the military's attention, an institution that, in interwar Japan, saw scientific innovation as integral to national strategy. Japan's rapid militarization was underpinned by the imperial government's vision of expansion. Throughout East Asia, science and technology, especially in the domains of medicine and engineering, were seen as essential to realizing this vision. Ishii, eager to apply his knowledge to real-world problems, was recruited into the Imperial Japanese Army Medical Corps in the early 1920s. His appointment was both a recognition of his capabilities and a reflection of the military's intention to harness cutting-edge research for strategic purposes. Upon entering service, Ishii was initially assigned to conventional medical duties at military hospitals. These roles provided insight into the logistical realities of military healthcare, managing outbreaks, treating battlefield wounds, and administering sanitation protocols. However, Ishii quickly distinguished himself not just as a capable physician, but as an innovator with the ambition to revolutionize military medicine. It was in this context that Ishii first broached the subject of biological warfare with his superiors. This was a risky proposition, advising on unconventional methods that transgressed established norms. Yet, Ishii's arguments, buttressed by scientific evidence and nationalistic rhetoric, found resonance. He posited that biological weapons could serve as force multipliers, offering Japan a strategic edge against numerically superior adversaries. The Imperial Army's upper echelons, increasingly enticed by the promise of unconventional warfare, began to provide Ishii with resources and autonomy to pursue research into pathogenic agents and their weaponization. Dubbed a scientific genius by some and disturbingly ambitious by others, Ishii formed the nucleus of a small cadre of like-minded officers and scientists. This group operated under the auspices of the Military Medical Division, tasked with investigating potential applications of bacteriological weapons. During these formative military years, Ishii traveled extensively, making site visits to disease control operations, field hospitals, and research institutions. His travels included clandestine meetings at foreign embassies and international scientific conferences, where he gleaned intelligence on Western advancements in biological warfare. These experiences reinforced Ishii's conviction Japan was lagging in a domain that could tip the balance of power. Ishii's relentless advocacy paid dividends. Military leaders granted him increasing latitude, establishing secret laboratories and allocating funds for equipment and personnel. These initial ventures, often shrouded in bureaucratic secrecy, laid the groundwork for future expansion. Ishii's status rose rapidly within the army, his reputation for innovation overshadowing concerns about ethical propriety. Imperial ambition and Ishii's personal drive proved mutually reinforcing. Ishii saw himself as a servant of the emperor, envisioning a new scientific vanguard capable of safeguarding Japan from external threats. The sanctity of the imperial mission, coupled with his belief in scientific progress, justified ever more radical proposals. He was granted access to privileged information, advanced laboratory resources, and authority over increasingly complex research projects. Throughout this period, Ishii cultivated influential allies among Japan's elite, senior military officials, political operatives, and academic gatekeepers became collaborators in his growing network. Ishii was adept at leveraging these relationships, using his scientific gravitas to extract concessions and bypass procedural hurdles. In return, he offered not just expertise, but the promise of strategic invincibility through science. By the late 1920s, Ishii's transition from academic prodigy to military innovator was complete. He now operated at the nexus of science, strategy, and politics, a position that afforded both tremendous opportunity and peril. The boundaries between legitimate research and clandestine weaponization became ever more blurred. Ishii's ambition dovetailed with the army's aggressive posture, accelerating the pace of biological warfare development. Critical to Ishii's effectiveness was his ability to manage large, multidisciplinary teams. Military protocols provided the hierarchical structure necessary to enforce discipline, but Ishii's leadership style combined authoritarian control with bursts of creative freedom. He demanded excellence and unwavering loyalty, rewarding innovation but brooking no dissent. This blend of rigidity and opportunism proved effective. shaping the culture of future research units. Under his direction, the intersection of imperial ambition and scientific prowess reached a crescendo as Ishii prepared to launch his most infamous initiative, a research unit designed to merge medical discovery with battlefield application, operating well beyond the constraints of conventional ethics or international law. In the eyes of the military, Ishii was more than a scientist. He was a harbinger of a new era in warfare. Through this convergence of expertise, ambition, and state power, Ishii laid the foundations for Unit 731, a legacy steeped in both innovation and infamy. As subsequent chapters will reveal, his commitment to untrammeled science, driven by imperial imperatives, would unleash suffering on a scale unprecedented in modern history. Chapter 4. Birth of Unit 731, Secret Research begins. The genesis of Unit 731 represented a turning point not only in Shirō Ishii's career, but also in the annals of military medicine and warfare. It was in the context of escalating Sino-Japanese tensions and a quest for technological supremacy that Ishii was given the mandate to create a research unit dedicated to biological experimentation and weapon development. In the early 1930s, Ishii presented a comprehensive proposal to senior officials within the Imperial Japanese Army. Drawing on his academic expertise and foreign intelligence, he outlined the strategic potential of biological weapons, emphasizing the ability to induce mass casualties, sow panic, and undermine enemy infrastructure. The decision to establish Unit 731 was made in utmost secrecy, circumventing diplomatic channels and international scrutiny. Unit 731's initial headquarters was set up in the remote Manchurian town of Pingfang, selected for its isolation and proximity to strategic rail lines. The surrounding landscape provided both concealment and logistical support, enabling vast clandestine operations. Ishii was appointed commander, granted sweeping authority to recruit personnel, procure materials, and design experimental protocols. Without oversight, the unit's early mission was ambitious. Its objectives encompassed the development of weaponized pathogens, the testing of dissemination techniques, and the evaluation of defensive countermeasures. Planning documents reveal that Ishii envisioned Unit 731 as a state-of-the-art center for scientific discovery, possessing laboratories, animal breeding facilities, and even crematoria. The infrastructure was soon expanded to include barracks for staff, prison blocks for experimental subjects, and medical theaters for autopsies. To populate the unit, Ishii assembled a team of over 1,000 scientists, doctors, technicians, and guards. Recruitment focused on ambitious young researchers, many drawn by the promise of unconstrained scientific exploration and swift career advancement. Personnel were required to pledge allegiance to both Ishii and the imperial cause. Underscoring the fusion of national service and personal loyalty, secrecy was paramount. Unit 731 operated under multiple aliases: Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, being the most prominent, designed to mask its true purpose from both foreign intelligence and the local population. Existence of the unit was tightly controlled by military censorship, reinforced through propaganda and strict penalties for disclosure. The unit's initial experiments centered on the cultivation and weaponization of major pathogenic agents: plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax. Laboratory protocols were established to maximize virulence and survivability under battlefield conditions. Ishii personally directed many early trials, demanding innovation and meticulous record-keeping. Positive results were rapidly scaled, and failures were ruthlessly analyzed for improvement. Human experimentation began almost immediately, a practice rooted in both scientific rationale and imperial doctrine. Prisoners, captured from conflict zones or seized in covert police actions, were subjected to a range of brutal tests. These included exposure to infectious aerosols, injection with experimental vaccines and toxins, and surgical procedures performed without anesthesia. The rationale was twofold: to obtain live data on disease progression, and to test the lethality and transmissibility of weaponized agents. The institutional culture within Unit 731 mirrored Ishii's philosophy: unwavering discipline, intellectual rigor, and a profound disregard for human rights characterized daily operations. Internal propaganda emphasized the heroism of scientific sacrifice, framing researchers as warriors in Japan's quest for dominance. Surviving testimonies indicate that staff were indoctrinated to rationalize suffering as necessary for national advancement, a process that blunted moral resistance to the atrocities unfolding. As Unit 731 expanded, logistical sophistication grew apace. Dedicated supply chains transported equipment, animals, and human subjects. Command protocols formalized the chain of responsibility, insulating researchers from external accountability. Ishii's management style, authoritative yet charismatic, fostered fierce loyalty and an esprit de corps among core staff. Offsetting the psychological toll exacted by the nature of their work, international developments further shaped the unit's trajectory. Awareness of Western biological warfare research spurred competitive innovation, creating a climate of paranoia and urgency. Ishii instituted regular intelligence briefings, analyzed foreign scientific literature, and adapted methods as required. The ambition was clear. Unit 731 should set the global standard for biological research, irrespective of cost or consequence. Throughout this phase, the Japanese government maintained plausible deniability. Public references to epidemic prevention and water purification allowed for diplomatic engagement. Even as the unit's true operations escalated, occasionally, senior officials visited Pingfang to inspect facilities and observe experiments, offering Ishii commendations for his progress. These gestures reinforced the state's tacit endorsement, further emboldening the unit's activities. By the mid-1930s, Unit 731 stood as a monument to the dark possibilities of science harnessed for power. Ishii's dream had been realized: a secret empire where human suffering was currency for discovery, and the boundaries of ethical restraint had all but vanished. The stage was set for an intensification of research, infrastructure, and innovation, paving the way for yet greater horrors. Chapter 5: The Philosophy of Experimentation. At the heart of Unit 731 lay a philosophy that fused scientific curiosity with nationalistic ambition, ultimately underpinning one of the most egregious violations of medical ethics in modern history. Shirō Ishii, a physician and microbiologist of remarkable intellect, believed fervently in the transformative power of scientific research, especially in the service of the state. His vision for experimentation transcended the traditional boundaries of academia and care, fixating instead on the potential of biology as an instrument of war. Ishii's early career was marked by a voracious appetite for discovery. Educated at the Imperial University of Kyoto, his doctoral thesis had already showcased a penchant for pushing scientific boundaries, but it was in the charged atmosphere of pre-war Japan, with its surging militarism and desire for technological superiority, that Ishii's ambitions found fertile ground. He proposed to the Imperial Japanese Army the creation of a dedicated research facility for biological warfare, laying out a meticulous plan for unleashing pathogens as military weapons and employing human experimentation to ensure their efficacy. The guiding philosophy at Unit 731 was shaped by three critical pillars: the primacy of state security, the necessity of scientific rigor, and the expendability of selected human subjects. According to Ishii, the exigencies of war justified extraordinary measures. If victory could be assured through the deployment of biological weapons, then any price, including the suffering of prisoners, was deemed acceptable. Ishii couched this conviction in the language of utilitarianism, weighing the greater good of national survival over the individual rights of the research subjects. This philosophical underpinning manifested in the design of the experiments themselves. Emphasis was placed on the authenticity of data, meaning live human subjects were necessary to gather information about the effects of pathogens, chemical agents, and invasive procedures. Ishii argued that animal models, though useful, fell short in replicating the complexity of human biology, especially concerning immune responses, disease progression, and transmission mechanisms. As a result, thousands of prisoners, primarily Chinese and Russian, were conscripted into research protocols without consent, destined to endure infection, surgical intervention, and worse. Yet Ishii's philosophy was not devoid of contradiction. While extolling scientific rigor, he disregarded essential principles of reproducibility, transparency, and humane treatment. The experiments were not subject to peer review. Data was classified and shared only within a tight cadre of military officials and select scientists. Ethical oversight was deemed unnecessary, as the subjects were defined by the regime as subhuman enemies, stripped of rights and dignity. This environment fostered a culture in which young researchers and officers were socialized to accept brutality as a scientific norm. Medical graduates arriving at Unit 731 underwent indoctrination, learning not only a new repertoire of laboratory skills, but also a worldview in which suffering was a variable to be manipulated at will. The rhetoric of patriotic sacrifice was pervasive, casting perpetrators as heroes rather than violators of human conscience. Furthermore, Ishii's philosophy intersected with Japanese cultural attitudes toward hierarchy and duty. The chain of command was absolute, and questioning orders was tantamount to betrayal. As a result, many scientists and soldiers rationalized their participation as obedience to a superior, while an absolution from personal responsibility. The legacy of this philosophy extends far beyond the walls of Harbin. It provokes enduring questions about the intersection of science and morality, especially under conditions of war. How does one weigh potential benefits against immediate suffering? Can national security ever justify the suspension of ethical principles? In Unit 731, the pursuit of knowledge became inextricably linked with the systematic infliction of harm, illuminating the perilous edge upon which science can tread when unmoored from compassion. Ultimately, Ishii's philosophy of experimentation stands as a cautionary tale. It reveals how intellectual brilliance, unbridled by ethical boundaries, may catalyze innovation and atrocity alike. As this book will demonstrate, the consequences of his vision reverberate not only in historical memory but also in contemporary debates over medical research and the moral architecture of science. Chapter 6: Human Subjects, the Dark Reality. Unit 731's human experimentation remains one of the most appalling violations of medical ethics ever perpetrated. Beneath the veneer of scientific progress, thousands of men, women, and children suffered and died within its shadowed confines. Shirō Ishii's philosophy, which prized data over dignity, translated into a relentless quest to harness human bodies as living instruments. In a grisly symphony of suffering, the selection of subjects at Unit 731 was systematic and deliberate. The majority were Chinese civilians, supplemented by Russian prisoners of war, Korean nationals, and, on rare occasions, allied personnel. Categorized as logs, a term deliberately chosen to dehumanize the prisoners, were stripped of identity, rights, and even the hope of survival. For Ishii and his associates, these individuals were not patients but mere variables in the pursuit of military advantage. Upon arrival, the subjects were subjected to intensive observation and categorization. Medical histories were recorded, baseline measurements taken, and physical examinations conducted not to heal, but to establish controls for subsequent experimentation. Prison cells were cramped, poorly lit, and intentionally designed to destroy morale. The relentless psychological pressure began from day one, with guards and scientists working in concert to maintain an atmosphere of fear and helplessness. The range of experiments conducted was staggering in its scope and cruelty. Infectious agents such as plague, cholera, anthrax, and dysentery were injected into subjects, often without anesthesia. The aim was to test modes of infection, disease progression, and the effectiveness of treatments or countermeasures. Some experiments focused on the transmission vectors. Prisoners were exposed to fleas, contaminated water, or aerosolized pathogens to analyze how disease is spread among populations. Surgical experimentation was equally brutal. Vivisection was performed on living prisoners without anesthesia or analgesia. Under the guise of live tissue analysis, Organs were removed to study pathophysiology. Limbs were amputated and reattached. Wounds were deliberately infected to monitor healing processes. Other trials involved exposure to extreme temperatures, starvation, dehydration, and the effects of toxic chemicals. These acts were not the result of individual sadism, but systematic policy. Detailed records were maintained, documenting not only the physical effects but also psychological breakdowns. Prisoners were observed as diseases ravaged their bodies, often enduring untold agony before death claimed them. At no point were subjects afforded the right to refuse or withdraw. Consent was a concept rendered obsolete in the face of military prerogative. Yet, amid this darkness, there existed moments of resistance and humanity. Some prisoners attempted escape, while others formed bonds of solidarity in the face of impending death. Whispers of compassion circulated among a handful of staff, typically recruits appalled by the brutality. Such impulses were ruthlessly suppressed, and dissenters faced severe punishment or reassignment. Post-mortem, the remains of the victims were disposed of with mechanical efficiency. Some were cremated, others interred in mass graves within the complex, their identities erased. The data extracted from their suffering became fodder for reports circulated among Japanese military and scientific circles. The legacy of these experiments is difficult to reconcile. On one hand, valuable information about infectious disease transmission and pathogenesis was obtained. Data still considered ethically problematic and rarely cited in modern research. On the other hand, the cost paid in human suffering and moral bankruptcy is incalculable. The dark reality of human subjects within Unit 731 forces us to confront the fundamental questions of science. Under tyranny, what lines may never be crossed, regardless of circumstance, in the face of national survival? Does the imperative to protect justify the deliberate infliction of pain? The answers lie buried within the graves of Manchuria, echoing in the stories of those who never returned, and serving as a harrowing reminder that science, divorced from conscience, can become an instrument of profound destruction. Chapter 7: Biological Warfare, Early Tests and Innovations. The structured brutality of Unit 731 belied a sophisticated machinery of innovation in biological warfare. Shirō Ishii's vision extended beyond mere data collection. He was intent on engineering a new paradigm in military strategy, one in which invisible pathogens could cripple enemy forces more efficiently than bullets or explosives. In this pursuit, Unit 731 became one of the most advanced biological warfare research centers of its time, producing techniques and technologies that would influence global military thinking. For decades, the earliest tests focused on weaponizing infectious diseases with historic pedigrees as agents of mass destruction. Ishii and his team prioritized those pathogens particularly suited to the climate and terrain of northeastern China: plague, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax. These diseases, known for their lethality and ease of transmission, became the foundation upon which experiments were designed. Initial field trials involved the deliberate contamination of water supplies. Rivers and wells near villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters were seeded with cholera and typhoid cultures. The aim was to cripple local populations, reduce guerrilla activity, and test the viability of disease as a tool for population control. Detailed metrics were gathered from infection rates to mortality statistics, and the information was relayed back for scientific analysis. A parallel emphasis was placed on vector-borne transmission, particularly the use of fleas in spreading plague. Ishii pioneered the mass cultivation of infected fleas, eventually deploying ceramic bombs filled with the insects over targeted communities. The results were devastating. Outbreaks erupted rapidly, overwhelming local medical infrastructure and generating panic among civilian populations. These field tests provided crucial information about dispersal patterns, survivability, and the optimal conditions for sustained epidemics. Notably, the researchers at Unit 731 also ventured into the realm of aerosolized pathogen delivery. Laboratories within the compound were outfitted with pressurized chambers and sprayers designed to simulate the effects of airborne bacteria in enclosed environments. Human subjects were exposed to these conditions, enabling scientists to study infection kinetics and the potential for rapid contamination, especially in urban settings. Innovation extended to the technical apparatus designed for war. Special bombs were manufactured for the Imperial arsenal, capable of dispersing liquid, powder, or insect vectors over wide areas. These devices underwent rigorous testing, with improvements made in yield, survivability, and ease of deployment. Field units were trained on use and maintenance, integrating biological warfare into broader military operations. Ishii's greatest achievement may have been his ability to fuse scientific rigor with military pragmatism. Each experiment fed a feedback loop of knowledge, informing both the design of pathogens and the tactics for deployment, focusing on the minutiae: humidity, temperature, population density, and even urban layout. Unit 731 developed operational models that could be employed regardless of terrain or opposition. However, the consequences of these innovations were catastrophic. Outbreaks often spilled beyond intended test zones, sweeping through non-combatant populations and causing rampant suffering and death. Disease became a weapon unbound by the limitations of conventional warfare. It was indiscriminate, uncontrollable, and persistent. Within the Japanese military hierarchy, Unit 731's success in biological innovation garnered significant acclaim. Reports extolling the efficacy of plague bombs and contaminated foodstuffs were circulated among the high command. Ishii's expertise was sought for strategic planning, and his methods increasingly influenced broader Japanese biosecurity initiatives. Yet, the deeper legacy of these early tests and innovations is their moral cost. The calculus of efficiency and effectiveness ignored the ravages inflicted on human bodies and communities. The suffering generated in pursuit of operational superiority was justified within the philosophical framework Ishii had established, where the survival of the state eclipsed individual rights. Today, the relevance of Unit 731's biological warfare research cannot be understated. The techniques and technologies pioneered remain at the core of contemporary biodefense policy and international law, informing debates about bioethics and the regulation of dual-use research. The lessons are stark. Innovation in warfare, especially biological, is fraught with dangers well beyond the battlefield. The story of Unit 731's early tests and innovations serves as both a warning and a guidepost. It reveals both the breathtaking ingenuity and appalling consequences of scientific progress harnessed for destruction. As we face future pandemics and continue the march of technological advancement, the lessons of Harbin underscore the enduring obligation to place humanity above invention and to ensure that scientific innovation never again becomes a vehicle for mass suffering. Chapter 8: Expansion and Infrastructure of Unit 731. By the late 1930s, the initial vision for Unit 731 had developed into a sprawling complex of research, manufacturing, and testing, a testament to Shirō Ishii's organizational prowess and the Japanese military's commitment to biological warfare. The infrastructure of Unit 731 became a microcosm of calculated efficiency and scientific brutality, with its expansion mirroring the deepening commitment to systemic human experimentation. Located in Pingfang on the outskirts of Harbin, the main administration facility of Unit 731 stretched across several square kilometers. At its heart lay a network of laboratories dedicated to bacteriological and pathological research. These laboratories were equipped with cutting-edge equipment, centrifuges, incubators, autoclaves, and extensive culture banks for maintaining and modifying pathogens. Funding was virtually unlimited, channeled from the highest echelons of military command, allowing Ishii to recruit a cadre of skilled scientists and technicians. Adjacent to the laboratories were the so-called test chambers, a euphemism for the prison cell blocks and isolation wards where human subjects were confined. The architecture was deliberate: thick concrete walls to prevent escapes, sealed doors to contain airborne pathogens, and observation ports allowing scientists to monitor subjects without direct contact. These blocks were flanked by operating theaters where surgeons could perform vivisection, organ removal, and other invasive procedures on live subjects. The sterilization and disposal of biological waste were meticulously managed, ensuring safety for staff while facilitating ongoing experimentation. Expansion of Unit 731 was not restricted to Pingfang alone. Satellite units were constructed across occupied territories codenamed Unit 100, Unit 1644, and others each specializing in particular aspects of biological warfare, toxicology, or disease ecology. These branches extended the reach of Ishii's operations, enabling simultaneous experiments across different climates and populations. Communication between units was streamlined, with data and reports regularly exchanged through secure channels. Infrastructure also included dedicated manufacturing facilities, large-scale production of bacterial cultures, cultures of fleas and ticks, chemical agents, and delivery devices such as bombs and sprayers was carried out in integrated workshops. These manufacturing units were staffed by a combination of technical specialists and military personnel, or operating under strict secrecy protocols. Supplies were stored in reinforced bunkers and transported under armed guard to test sites or military bases. To support the administrative complexity, Ishii established an elaborate chain of command. Civilian scientists, military officers, medical doctors, and logistics staff were recruited and rigorously vetted for loyalty. Training programs were instituted, indoctrinating newcomers in both laboratory skills and the ideological framework. Supporting the experiments, the administrative structure was hierarchical and inflexible, modeled on military command to ensure discipline and operational secrecy. Security measures were omnipresent. The facility was ringed by barbed wire, patrolled by armed guards, and monitored by surveillance outposts. Entry and exit required special clearance, and unauthorized movement within the complex was strictly prohibited. The perimeter was protected by minefields and guard towers designed to deter both external attack and internal escape attempts. Even supply deliveries and waste disposal were subject to elaborate verification procedures to prevent leaks of information or contamination. To facilitate operational efficiency, Unit 731 deployed a dedicated transportation network. Rail sidings, motor pools and truck convoys moved supplies, personnel, and on occasion, prisoners between sites. These logistical arteries ensured that the flow of resources was uninterrupted, and that new test subjects could be sourced as needed. The expansion of infrastructure reflected Ishii's broader strategic vision. Biological warfare was not an auxiliary tactic, but a pillar of Japanese military power. The sheer scale of the facilities enabled experimentation at a level unmatched elsewhere in the world, allowing for the systematic testing of diseases, weapons, and procedures on thousands of human subjects. Yet, this growth came at a profound human and moral cost. The efficiency of Unit 731's infrastructure translated into the mechanization of suffering. Every new laboratory, test chamber, and satellite branch was another node in the apparatus of cruelty designed to advance strategic goals at the expense of human life. As the institution expanded, so did complicity. More soldiers, doctors, and administrators became embroiled in its grim operations. The infrastructural legacy of Unit 731 endures in the physical remnants scattered across Manchuria, the meticulously kept records, and the testimonies of survivors and victims' families. It stands as a chilling reminder of what can be accomplished when scientific ability and organizational prowess are harnessed to destructive ends, and serves as a compelling warning against the unchecked growth of harmful enterprise in the name of progress. Chapter 9. Collaboration and cover-ups within the military. The operations of Unit 731 would not have flourished without the extensive collaboration and protection afforded by the Japanese military establishment. The relationship between the research complex and military command was symbiotic, shielded from public scrutiny by layers of deceit, denial, and institutional complicity. The path from Ishii's initial proposal to the operational secrecy that Enveloped Unit 731 illuminates the power of the state to enable and conceal atrocity in pursuit of strategic goals. Formal collaboration began with the endorsement of biological warfare research at the highest levels of the Imperial Japanese Army. Ishii's reputation as an innovative scientist earned him influential supporters among the general staff, who saw in his work the potential for military advantage unmatched by conventional weaponry. Funding, logistical support, and political cover were channeled through secret budget lines, bypassing civilian oversight. Key to the success of Unit 731 was the integration of military personnel into every tier of the operation. Officers were assigned not only to manage logistics and security, but also to oversee experimental protocols, liaise with other branches, and coordinate field deployments of biological weapons. The chain of command blurred the lines between science and combat. Experimentation was understood as a direct contribution to the war effort, and obedience was strictly enforced. Collaboration extended beyond administrative support to encompass field operations. Special task forces were organized to disseminate pathogens in target villages, retrieve subjects for experimentation, and recover data from outbreaks. These units operated under strict secrecy, often masquerading as medical humanitarian teams, and their actions were shielded from hostile eyes by fabricated reports and disinformation campaigns. Cover-ups became systemic practice as the atrocities committed within Unit 731 began to draw suspicion from international observers and, occasionally, domestic critics. Reports of unusual disease outbreaks, mass deaths, and mysterious disappearances in occupied territories were routinely dismissed as natural phenomena or enemy propaganda. Military censors tightly controlled all communication leaving the facility, and personnel were instructed to destroy incriminating evidence at the end of each project. The end of World War II brought both chaos and opportunity for those involved in Unit 731. As defeat loomed, Ishii and his associates launched a calculated campaign to erase the facility's legacy. Laboratories were dismantled, records incinerated, and surviving prisoners killed to eliminate witnesses. Key personnel were dispersed or hidden, and the physical infrastructure was either destroyed or repurposed by advancing Soviet forces. Perhaps the most lasting cover-up occurred during the American occupation of Japan. In exchange for access to Unit 731's research data, US authorities agreed not to prosecute Ishii and his collaborators for war crimes. This Faustian bargain effectively shielded those involved from legal accountability, granting them immunity and allowing some to continue careers in medicine, academia, and government. The official records of Unit 731 remained sealed for decades, and the extent of collaboration between Japanese and Allied officials only slowly emerged through archival investigation and testimony. The consequences of military collaboration and cover-ups are manifold. On a practical level, they facilitated the efficient execution of biological warfare research, extending Japan's strategic reach during the war. On a moral level, they legitimized the suffering inflicted on thousands, treating victims as disposable elements in the machinery of victory. The suppression of truth further compounded the harm, denying justice, recognition, and closure to those affected. The story of Unit 731's relationship with the military thus stands as a powerful indictment of institutional complicity. It underscores the ease with which organizations can subordinate ethics to strategy, and the enduring need for transparency, accountability, and vigilance. Only through honest confrontation with the past can the full lessons of this tragic collaboration be appreciated and acted upon. Chapter 10. Life inside the camp. Soldiers and prisoners. To understand Unit 731's legacy, one must enter its labyrinth, literal and metaphorical, and witness the daily lives of those who resided within its boundaries. The compound in Pingfang, northeast China, was no ordinary military installation. Behind towering walls and electrified fences, blanketed by bitter Manchurian winds, was a hidden city of horrors, laboratories, dissection halls, and cell blocks that witnessed the degradation of war's last restrained human dignity. The personnel within Unit 731 were a microcosm of Imperial Japan's military and intellectual elite. Soldiers, medics, and scientists moved in a rigid hierarchy, adhering to a code not only of martial discipline but also of unwavering secrecy. Recruitment favored medical school graduates, bacteriologists, and physiologists. Many arrived lured by prestige, scientific curiosity, or the mere sense of patriotic duty instilled by pro-war nationalist fervor. Once inside, however, they were drawn into a ruthless culture that extolled results above humanity. Efficacy over empathy. Life for soldiers was superficially one of order, with routine drills, flag-raising ceremonies, and structured schedules. Yet beneath the facade, they were complicit in or witnesses to acts that transgressed the boundaries of traditional military conduct. Some justified their actions as necessary for national survival. Others grew desensitized, regarding prisoners as no more than experimental material, Maruta logs, as they chillingly called human subjects. The process of dehumanization was deliberate and systematic, dulling any instinct for compassion and normalizing the abnormal. The prisoners represented a tragic spectrum of East Asia's wartime populations. Chinese civilians, anti-Japanese resistance fighters, Korean and Russian captives, and a handful of Allied POWs were swept into Unit 731's maw. Their fates were predetermined upon arrival. They became live test subjects for diseases, frostbite, vivisection without anesthesia, and other agonies so severe that even many soldiers inured to violence found it difficult to witness. The prisoners lived in squalid, overcrowded cells, monitored day and night, deprived of basic comforts, and exposed to the ever-present specter of medicalized death. Survivor accounts or accounts relayed by rare escapees and released personnel describe an unrelenting regime of fear and deprivation. Meals were meager, hygienes ignored, and diseases were rampant. Yet perhaps the most profound terror was psychological. The sudden, arbitrary selection for experimentation meant that any day might be the last. Bonds flourished among prisoners in whispered prayers and coded exchanges, but solidarity could not shield them from the caprice of their captors. The interaction between guards and captives was governed by both cruelty and a chilling sense of detachment. Guards seldom spoke to prisoners except in the discharge of duty. Empathy was dangerous. To question was to risk suspicion or transfer to the experimental wings oneself. When new arrivals among the staff balked at their role, senior officers methodically re-educated them, recasting moral qualms as weaknesses. This manufactured distance perpetuated by language, uniform, and ideology was indispensable to the functioning of the camp's cruel machinery. Not all soldiers within Unit 731 participated willingly. Testimonies unearthed decades later reveal a spectrum of attitudes, from zealous devotion to grim resignation. Some justified their work as noble, convinced that triumph in war demanded sacrifice. Others steeled themselves through alcohol, detachment, or grim camaraderie. Nonetheless, compliance was sustained by rigid discipline and a web of surveillance. To dissent was to invite suspicion, disciplinary action, or worse. The physical layout of Pingfang itself mirrored the camp's duality. Laboratories modern, sterile, and well-equipped stood alongside windowless cell blocks reeking of human despair. Daily, staff moved between these worlds, washing their hands and donning new uniforms, attempting to partition their scientific endeavors from the suffering they wrought. For some, the compartmentalization remained imperfect. Nightmares, breakdowns, and rare acts of dissent left traces still uncovered by historians. The end of a prisoner's life within Unit 731 was, for most, shrouded in secrecy. Bodies were burned, records sanitized, and stories buried. Yet the spectral presence of these lives remains, haunting the testimonies of those who survived and the collective memory of those who later learned of the camp's existence. In sum, life inside Unit 731 was the collision of order and chaos, discipline and depravity, scientific inquiry and unfathomable suffering. To dwell in its confines was to inhabit a world where moral norms had been inverted, and where every day seen through the eyes of both soldiers and prisoners became a struggle to navigate the abyss opened by war and sanctioned by authority. Chapter 11, Ethical, Blindness and Scientific Rationalization. The horrors that transpired within Unit 731 were not merely the product of individual malice, but the consequence of a broader and more insidious phenomenon: ethical blindness, cultivated and reinforced by scientific rationalization. To fully appreciate the mechanisms that enabled such atrocities, it is crucial to examine not only the personal morality of those involved, but also the ideological and institutional frameworks that rendered the unthinkable routine. Unit 731 did not operate in a moral vacuum. Rather, it was a byproduct of interlinked currents in Japanese society: ultranationalism, imperial ambition, and a growing belief in the primacy of science as a tool of statecraft. Central to this ethos was Dr. Shirō Ishii, who combined charismatic leadership with an unwavering devotion to empirical advancement. Underwriting his justifications for the unit's operations was a vision of science, detached from the constraints of ethics, a belief that any experiment, no matter how inhumane, was permissible if it served the greater good of the empire. This rationalization began with language. Prisoners as logs were stripped semantically of humanity, facilitating their transformation into data points rather than individuals. The culture of dehumanization extended through official documents, educational lectures, and idle conversation among staff members. By the time experiments were underway, the moral leap from subject to object had been entrenched, and the boundary between medical research and mechanized torture erased. Ishii himself played a pivotal role in constructing this ethical myopia. A talented orator, he deployed rhetoric that painted the war as not merely a military conflict, but a contest for survival between races and civilizations. Framing his work as a patriotic imperative, he wielded moral ambiguity as a shield for scientific innovation. The message was clear: those who questioned the program's methods were not only obstructing progress, but imperiling the nation. Beyond individual persuasion, institutional inertia sustained and magnified this blindness. Official oversight was minimal, and bureaucratic culture rewarded loyalty and compliance over moral scrutiny. Reports that might have alarmed outsiders were censored or couched in euphemism. Young doctors and scientists, raised in a society that increasingly valorized obedience, found themselves swept along by the unit's momentum, internalizing its norms with little reflection. Moreover, the intellectual trends of the 1930s exacerbated this process. The ascendant doctrine of scientific modernism, which privileged objective results and technological prowess, was often invoked to justify ethical flexibility. In lectures and correspondence, Ishii and his peers cited the necessity of hard data to advance bacteriological warfare, a field where no international conventions at that time explicitly outlawed experimentation. While some privately harbored doubts, the dominant narrative quashed dissent and lionized those who pursued research unencumbered by sentiment. This rationalization was, however, not absolute. Among the ranks of Unit 731 and the scientific community at large, there were moments of hesitation, covert protest, and selective refusal. Yet these were usually isolated, countered by the prevailing conviction that the urgency of wartime necessity justified extraordinary measures. The very structure of command, with its compartmentalization and layered secrecy, insulated the highest echelons from awareness of everyday brutality, even as it remained hidden from the outside world. The intersection of science and state power reached its zenith within the grim efficiency of Unit 731. What began as a theoretical inquiry into infectious diseases quickly metastasized into industrialized experimentation. Prisoners exposed to plague, infected with cholera, or vivisected alive in the name of understanding pathogenesis. Perpetrators recorded data with clinical detachment, their ethical faculties overridden by the pursuit of knowledge and national victory. Yet, as the war drew on and reports of allied investigations into war crimes circulated, the edifice of rationalization began to crack. Some within Unit 731 faced belated moral reckoning, haunted by the realization of what they had enabled or done. For most, however, the ingrained justifications persisted long after Japan's surrender, echoing in post-war testimonials that alternately denied, minimized, or valorized their role. Ultimately, the ethical blindness of Unit 731 reveals the peril at the intersection of science and power, when intellectual curiosity, unmoored from empathy and oversight, becomes an engine for atrocity. The rationalizations furnished by Ishii and his staff echo through history as a stark warning that progress, when severed from principles, can transmute even the noblest ambitions into cruelty. By dissecting these rationalizations, we not only document the past, but safeguard the future against the return of such moral eclipse. Chapter 12, Disease as a Weapon Plague, Cholera and Anthrax. At the very heart of Unit 731's operation was the weaponization of disease. Under Shirō Ishii's direction, the camp's laboratories became hothouses of biological innovation and horror, churning out weaponized strains of plague, cholera and anthrax. The intersection of medical science and militarism fueled ambitions not merely to defend Japan, but to devastate its adversaries with unseen, insidious forces. The bacterial warfare program at Unit 731 was unprecedented in both scale and scope. Ishii, ever the visionary, believed that controlling disease equated to controlling destiny. His philosophy, articulated in numerous lectures to subordinates, rested on the assertion that pathogens could strike silently where conventional arms failed, breaking enemy morale and overwhelming logistics. With the full support of the Japanese military, Ishii established a series of research protocols that pushed the boundaries of scientific experimentation and moral justification. The production of plague bacteria relied on a blend of scientific acumen and industrial pragmatism. Fleas, the primary vectors of the disease, were painstakingly bred and infected with Yersinia pestis. To create weapons-grade cultures, prisoners were deliberately inoculated with the bacteria and monitored as the disease progressed. The precise course of infection, symptoms, and eventual death were documented in exhaustive detail, yielding both useful data and a steady supply of contaminated tissue, from which to propagate further cultures. Cholera, another focus of the unit's research, served as both a tool of experimentation and a field weapon. Water sources in the region surrounding Pingfang were systematically contaminated to test the effects and transmission pathways. Prisoners consumed tainted water, often under the guise of routine hygiene checks, and their decline was charted alongside various efforts to develop vaccines and treatments for Japanese troops. The dual imperative to cure one's allies, to kill one's enemies, drove the scientific staff to ever greater extremes of ingenuity and ruthlessness. Perhaps the most insidious of the unit's projects involved anthrax. Unlike plague and cholera, which depended on environmental factors for transmission, anthrax spores could remain dormant yet lethal for years. Experiments exposed prisoners to varying doses, sought optimal delivery mechanisms such as bombs, pellets, or aerial sprayers, and analyzed survivability rates. The enduring lethality of the spores made anthrax an ideal candidate for long-term area denial, a prospect that attracted the attention of military planners at the highest levels. The data generated by these experiments had chilling applications beyond the laboratory. Field tests were conducted in the surrounding areas, sometimes using live populations of unsuspecting villagers as unwitting experimental cohorts. In one notorious episode, plague-infected fleas were released in Chinese towns, triggering outbreaks that devastated local populations, while permitting Japanese scientists to monitor the effects at a distance. The boundaries between laboratory, battlefield, and civilian life rapidly dissolved. For those within Unit 731, the scientific challenge was both intoxicating and inexorable. Detailed protocols were established to minimize cross-contamination among staff, and sophisticated methods were devised for tracking pathogen evolution and resistance. The laboratory yielded findings that, in peacetime, might have earned acclaim for their rigor. In their context, however, these contributions to microbiology were inseparable from the suffering and death that enabled them. The pursuit of weaponized disease also drove technological innovation. Ishii's team developed and tested delivery systems for pathogens, including porcelain bombs and aerial dispersal units. Reports indicate that upward of 200,000 Chinese civilians may have died as a result of biological attacks orchestrated or inspired by Unit 731, though exact numbers remain a subject of ongoing historical debate due to deliberate record destruction. The unit's fixation on disease reflected both a ruthless pragmatism and a fascination with the limits of biological control. To Ishii and his collaborators, the manipulation of life and death was the ultimate expression of scientific mastery. The human cost, the agony of prisoners, the devastation of entire villages was justified as a necessary step on the path to victory. Evidence of the thorough ethical blindness that pervaded the organization. When the war ended, many of Unit 731's findings were spirited away, hidden from international investigators or traded to foreign powers in exchange for immunity. The legacy of these experiments endures, not only in the scientific literature but in the scars left upon survivors, families, and communities targeted by biological warfare. The history of Unit 731 thus stands as a testament to the perils of unchecked scientific ambition and the enduring power of disease as both a tool of destruction and a symbol of humanity's capacity for self-deception. Chapter 13: War Crimes and International Awareness. The unveiling of Unit 731's deeds after Japan's defeat transformed the camp from a closely guarded military secret into a focal point for international outrage. As the whirlwind of war gave way to the careful scrutiny of occupation and justice, the nature, scale, and horror of what had transpired in Pingfang became, at last, a matter of public awareness. Yet, the road toward international recognition and accountability was labyrinthine, shaped by geopolitics, selective justice, and the cold calculations of the burgeoning Cold War. At the conclusion of World War II, Allied forces, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, prioritized the rapid investigation of Japanese war crimes. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, convened in 1946, was the most visible manifestation of this effort. Yet, from the outset, Unit 731 was treated as a matter requiring special handling. Its experiments, shrouded in secrecy and conducted far from the prying eyes of both Japan's general public and its foreign adversaries, had left scarred paper trails and produced few surviving witnesses. Those who knew its workings best, Shirō Ishii and his senior staff, had scattered, often taking meticulous measures to destroy evidence and silence potential whistleblowers. Nonetheless, the magnitude of atrocities could not remain concealed indefinitely. Testimonies from Chinese survivors, Soviet captives, and even disaffected Japanese personnel reached occupation authorities. The stories aligned in horrifying detail: epidemics that coincided with Japanese occupation, unexplained mass deaths, and the whispers of plague bombs and germ soldiers among rural populations. International humanitarian organizations began to mobilize, urging the prosecution of those responsible for crimes that, in their scope and systematic execution, defied all notions of scientific or military necessity. The response from occupation authorities was complicated by their own interests. The Americans, in particular, quickly perceived the scientific value embedded in the data collected at Unit 731, data that, despite its monstrous origins, offered insights into biological warfare and disease control otherwise unobtainable. Top-secret meetings were held with former Unit 731 officials, and immunity from prosecution was quietly offered in exchange for full disclosure of research findings. Unlike their German counterparts at Nuremberg, few members of Unit 731 ever stood before a war crimes tribunal. This decision triggered a wave of controversy in international circles, especially among nations that had suffered most under Japanese occupation. Chinese and Soviet delegations pressed for open acknowledgement and prosecution of biological warfare. The Soviets even conducted their own war crimes trials in Khabarovsk, publicizing accusations and securing confessions from some Unit 731 personnel. However, the reach of these proceedings was limited, and within Japan and its Western allies, Ishii and his collaborators largely entered post-war life unpunished. Their expertise soon reintegrated into civilian medicine, academia, and even the pharmaceutical industry. Public revelations nonetheless spurred widespread condemnation. Newspapers in the United States and Europe chronicled allegations of vivisection, germ warfare, and systematic mass murder, drawing uncomfortable parallels with the worst excesses of Nazi medical crime. In Japan, official response oscillated between denial, minimization, and gradual, reluctant acknowledgement as a trickle of documents and testimonies. Forced reckoning with the country's wartime actions. Legal scholarship and moral philosophy grappled with the unique nature of Unit 731's crimes. Was it possible, some asked, to draw lines between scientific research and criminal violence, between the innovations derived from human suffering and the imperative to seek justice? These debates echoed through the early frameworks of international humanitarian law, catalyzing revisions to the Geneva Conventions and contributing to the formation of post-war norms governing biological and chemical warfare. The ultimate legacy of Unit 731 in the international sphere is one of partial justice and perpetually unfinished reckoning. The survivors' voices, often marginalized by political expedients, sounded a continuing demand for acknowledgement and atonement. Historians and legal scholars continued to unearth evidence, ensuring that the nature of atrocities committed under Ishii's command would not vanish into the obscurity from which they emerged. In conclusion, international awareness of Unit 731's crimes bears witness to both the potential and the limits of post-war justice. It is a story of discovery and evasion, denunciation and complicity, a testament not only to the capacity for evil, but to the ongoing struggle of the world community to recognize, condemn, and learn from the darkest recesses of its own past. Chapter 14: Ishii's Personality, Charisma and Cruelty. Shirō Ishii remains one of the most enigmatic figures of 20th century science, not because his achievements were conventional, but because his persona encompassed qualities seldom found together. Ishii was, by all accounts, a man whose charisma was legendary. He possessed the rare ability to inspire loyalty, to galvanize colleagues into shared endeavors, and to persuade even the skeptical to embrace his vision. Yet, interwoven with these magnetic traits was an almost unfathomable capacity for cruelty, manifesting not as an emotional outburst, but as cold calculation. Born in 1892 in Chiyoda, Ishii demonstrated academic brilliance from a young age. His rapid advancement through Japan's educational hierarchy was marked by both intellectual dexterity and a relentless ambition. By the time he enrolled at Kyoto Imperial University, it was evident to many that Ishii was destined for a career of distinction. His peers and professors alike noted his persuasive eloquence, his ability to command attention, and his penchant for organizing ambitious projects. Upon entering military service, Ishii quickly recognized the untapped potential of biological warfare, a field then hovering on the frontier of medical science and military strategy. He advocated for investment in bacteriological research, arguing that such weapons could change the course of modern conflict. His persuasive skills were essential in converting skepticism within the Imperial Japanese Army into fervent support, securing funding and resources otherwise unheard of in wartime Japan. However, beneath this layer of inspiration, a more sinister element began to emerge. The personnel selected by Ishii for Unit 731 were not just the best and brightest in their fields, they were also those susceptible to his ideological influence. Ishii's charisma was, in many respects, an instrument of manipulation, enabling him to maintain secrecy, demand absolute loyalty, and encourage normalized participation in experiments that defied ethical boundaries. His leadership style, characterized by a relentless pursuit of innovation, created a culture where questioning authority was discouraged and dissent, if expressed, was swiftly suppressed. Ishii's cruelty manifested not merely in his willingness to sanction inhumane experiments, but in the systematic rationalization of those acts. Accounts from colleagues and subordinates reveal that Ishii fostered an environment where suffering was regarded as data, where test subjects, Often innocent civilians and prisoners of war were dehumanized into logs. The psychological toll on laboratory staff was significant, yet Ishii remained unwavering, pressing forward with new protocols and ever larger trials. The juxtaposition of charisma and cruelty became the defining paradigm of Unit 731. Ishii was a master of doublespeak, able to frame his program as a noble enterprise, even as its reality grew ever more gruesome. Meanwhile, he cultivated a mythos around himself, blending scientific authority with patriotic rhetoric. Many who worked under Ishii later recounted an ambivalence toward him: admiration for his vision and abilities, repulsion for his disregard for human life. Ishii's management of Unit 731 extended beyond technical oversight. He devised elaborate rewards and punishments, carefully balancing incentives to maintain morale while harshly disciplining those who faltered. Within this power structure, his charisma was wielded both as a shield and a weapon, enabling him to attract talent yet demand unquestioning obedience. Recruitment, training, and even professional advancement were subject to Ishii's personal approval, giving him near absolute control over the unit's inner workings. Personal details from surviving records depict Ishii as outwardly genial and urbane, possessing refined tastes and a penchant for theatrical gestures. Yet these were masks behind which he hid his meticulous planning of operations. That led to thousands of deaths. His colleagues noted his ability to compartmentalize, capable of enjoyment and camaraderie, only to transition without hesitation to authorizing the next phase of experimentation. Ishii's enduring infamy is inseparable from the duality that marked his leadership. He commanded devotion through both promise and threat, shaping a culture of compliance and ambition that allowed Unit 731 to thrive, long after the moral core of its mission had crumbled. It is this disturbing blend of charisma and cruelty that continues to provoke debate about the nature of evil, the seduction of power, and the perilous intersection of scientific progress and ethical responsibility. Chapter 15: The End of the War, Dissolution of Unit 731. As the Second World War marched toward its catastrophic conclusion, the fate of Unit 731 and its architect, Shirō Ishii, became inseparably entwined with the shifting fortunes of the Japanese Empire. The dissolution of Unit 731 did not occur as a single act, but rather unfolded through a complex process marked by secrecy, desperation, and the systematic destruction of evidence. By early 1945, Allied advances into Japanese-held territories signaled the inevitability of defeat. Within the labyrinthine compound in Pingfang, unease spread. Ishii, ever the pragmatist, recognized the urgency of covering up the unit's activities to shield not only his legacy, but also Japan's technological secrets from falling into enemy hands. Orders soon circulated to destroy all records, equipment, and remaining specimens related to germ warfare experiments. The number of lives lost and the extent of suffering became data points in files. Destined for incineration, the process was meticulously orchestrated. Ishii directed senior staff to initiate scorched earth protocols. Laboratories were flooded, buildings were razed, and thousands of documents consigned to flames. It was a plan designed as much to erase history as to protect individuals from prosecution. During these frantic days, unit members faced wrenching choices: to comply meant complicity in obliterating evidence, to dissent meant exposure and potential retribution. The human cost lingered in the shadows. Prisoners and test subjects, many of whom had survived initial trials, were executed or left to perish. Witness accounts speak of mass graves hurriedly filled, the sounds of gunfire echoing across deserted courtyards. Many researchers and military officers, still harboring loyalty to Ishii, participated without protest. Some attempted to flee, fearing that the Allied forces would arrive before the purge was complete. Amidst chaos, Ishii demonstrated an uncanny composure, shielded by his network of confidants within Japan's scientific and military establishment. He devised escape routes and false identities for key personnel. The dangerous knowledge amassed within Unit 731 details of biological agents, techniques for mass infection, and the results of lethal experiments became currency. In the looming negotiations with occupying powers, the physical dissolution of Unit 731 was only the beginning of a broader campaign to suppress its truth. In the weeks following Japan's surrender, Ishii and several close associates were absorbed into governmental and academic positions across the country. The surviving scientists dispersed, taking with them fragments of data and the specter of guilt. The buildings at Pingfang fell silent, their ruins testifying to the horrors deliberately hidden. Yet, elements of Unit 731's work had already begun to leak, both within Japan and to the Allied intelligence community. Rumors of grotesque human experimentation and bioweapons programs emerged in the post-war press, fueling outrage and demands for justice. However, the chaos of the occupation and the shifting priorities among Allied powers rendered immediate investigation difficult. Documentation, piecemeal and ambiguous, frustrated efforts to establish accountability. The dissolution of Unit 731 thus framed the subsequent politics of memory and denial. Ishii, shrewdly leveraging his scientific expertise and the strategic value of his research, offered knowledge in exchange for immunity. It was a chilling calculation, echoing the broader Faustian bargains that defined post-war Japan. The systemic destruction of evidence not only protected perpetrators, but also denied victims their voices, further obscuring the scale and nature of Unit 731's crimes. In the years that followed, the legacy of the unit's dissolution persisted. The moral ambiguities born from those final days acts carried out in the name of survival, scientific advancement, or national pride challenge historical analysis. The deliberate concealment of atrocities undermined both collective memory and the avenues for justice, shaping the contours of debate that continue to this day. This chapter, then, marks a pivotal moment, the transition from open horror to covered silence. The end of Unit 731 was not a neat cessation, but a dispersal or scattering of secrets, survivors, and consequences whose reverberations are still being charted. In the aftermath, the ethical wreckage left behind demanded more than records or confessions. It demanded remembrance, reckoning, and a determination not to allow science to serve cruelty unchecked. Chapter 16, Post-War Negotiations, Immunity and Silence. The defeat of Japan in 1945 marked both a rupture and an opportunity for those involved in Unit 731, as the Allied occupation extended its authority over the Japanese homeland. A complex web of negotiations emerged, centered on the fate of Ishii and his collaborators. The shadow of accountability loomed large, yet it was ultimately overshadowed by a strategic calculus that prioritized scientific intelligence over retributive justice. Shirō Ishii, acutely aware of his vulnerability, sought ways to protect himself and his associates from prosecution. The enormous repository of biological warfare knowledge accumulated at Unit 731 became Ishii's bargaining chip. Through clandestine back channels, he offered access to experimental data, methodologies, and samples to representatives of the United States Army, particularly those involved in advancements in biological weaponry. American intelligence, fascinated by the potential leap in biowarfare capabilities, soon entered into informal negotiations. The context was the incipient Cold War, where scientific supremacy promised enhanced security and leverage. The horrors perpetrated in Pingfang, fatal infections, vivisections, and extreme forms of testing were evaluated not as crimes but as sources of information. To the moral dismay of some occupying officials, pragmatism prevailed. Immunity was granted to key Unit 731 personnel in exchange for complete disclosures about Japanese bacteriological warfare techniques. Within the confidential records of these negotiations, a disturbing paradox is revealed. Ishii and his colleagues, many of whom were subject to international calls for criminal prosecution, wrote detailed reports, met with American scientists, and even lectured at secure installations. The data transferred was both specific and general, encompassing not just results but methodologies for conducting human experimentation. In these exchanges, the victims of Unit 731 faded from consideration. their suffering subordinated to the perceived utility of scientific progress. Immunity extended beyond mere reprieve from prosecution. Many former members of Unit 731 integrated themselves into prestigious academic and governmental positions post-war, leveraging their expertise in medicine, pharmacology, and public health. Ishii himself lived out his days in comparative comfort, shielded by promises made and secrets kept. The silence imposed by these agreements lingered, suppressing both domestic and international efforts to bring perpetrators before justice. The moral compromise inherent in these negotiations has been the subject of fierce debate. Such bargains subverted fundamental principles of accountability, raising difficult questions about the ethics of scientific research and the responsibilities of governments in the aftermath of atrocity. Survivors and advocacy groups who demanded recognition and restitution were met largely with bureaucratic indifference. The magnitude of betrayal felt by victims reverberates through their testimony, their voices haunting the records of those years. One of the most profound consequences of the Immunity for Knowledge Accord was a culture of silence that permeated both academic and government institutions in Japan. The history of Unit 731 became taboo, its mention discouraged or actively censored in official narratives. The few researchers who spoke out faced ostracism, loss of funding, and, in certain instances, threats to their safety internationally. These negotiations exemplified a broader trend of scientific complicity in post-war justice processes. The precedents set in Japan echoed in other arenas, where war criminals found protection in exchange for strategic advantage. Attempts to revisit the immunity agreements in later decades were met with institutional resistance, as vested interests continued to suppress acknowledgement and redress. The legacy of these post-war negotiations endures in the labyrinth of denials, half-truths, and selective amnesia maintained by successive governments. For historians and ethicists, the episode presents a cautionary tale. The pursuit of knowledge cannot absolve complicity in suffering. Progress built on silence threatens the very foundation of ethical inquiry. The unresolved tensions of these deals raise urgent questions about the balance between scientific advancement and moral responsibility. Ultimately, the immunity granted to Ishii and his colleagues did not erase the impact of their actions. The silence may have muted public outrage, but it never stilled the persistent demand for truth. As new evidence emerges and advocacy intensifies, the legacy of these negotiations is being re-examined. The shadow of Unit 731 continues to fall over science and policy alike, a reminder that silence sometimes can be as damning as speech. Chapter 17, Legacy of Horror. Survivors and historians speak. The legacy of Unit 731's horror reverberates through both survivor testimony and the diligent work of scholars who defied silence and denial. For decades, official narratives suppressed recognition of Japanese wartime atrocities, leaving survivors in the shadows and historians in search of fragmented clues. Survivors, many of them Chinese, Russian, Korean, and other prisoners of war, carried the burden of memory alone. Their experiences, both harrowing and singular, formed the living testament to cruelty masked in scientific inquiry. The wounds left behind were not solely physical but emotional. The degradation, fear, and relentless suffering endured in Ishii's laboratories left scars that persisted long after the war's end. Accounts from survivors describe a regime of terror in Unit 731's compounds. Daily life for prisoners was a procession of uncertainty. Some faced the agony of vivisection, their bodies used as living laboratories for experiments on disease and trauma. Others were exposed to pathogens, plague, cholera, typhus in calculated doses, with death or permanent disability inevitable. The staff, compelled by both loyalty to Ishii and the allure of advancement, seldom questioned the morality of their actions. Historians seeking to document these atrocities faced formidable obstacles. The systematic destruction of records, combined with post-war silence, rendered the evolution of Unit 731 difficult to trace. Early inquiries met with administrative resistance, while surviving scientists offered little more than vague denials or evasions. International attention waxed and waned. shaped by political interests and the early Cold War context. Nevertheless, through dogged research and interviews, a core group of historians began to piece together the unit's horrors, revelations in the 1980s and 1990s, spurred by the opening of archives and increased activism among survivors, changed the discourse permanently. Books, documentaries, and scholarly articles challenged official obfuscations, bringing the testimony of survivors into the wider public arena. The process of coming to terms with this legacy has been fraught with tension. Survivors advocated for recognition, compensation, and memorialization of those lost. Governments, reluctant to expose national shame or risk diplomatic fallout, impeded progress. The politicization of historical memory, particularly in Japan, led to public debates about the place of imperial atrocity in national identity. Some embraced acknowledgement and atonement as necessary for reconciliation. Others argued for forgiveness without full transparency. International organizations, including the United Nations, called for more rigorous investigation and education about Unit 731 and similar wartime atrocities. Museums and memorials in China and other affected countries became sites of pilgrimage and protest, serving as reminders that historical reckoning remains incomplete. The persistence of survivor testimony has forced a re-evaluation of how atrocities are remembered and taught. The voices of those who endured have become the foundation for ongoing efforts to achieve justice, inspire ethical reflection within the scientific community, and promote accountability. Their stories, once marginalized, now form the basis for a global conversation about the dangers of unchecked power, the limits of governmental secrecy, and the urgent need for cross-cultural understanding in confronting historical trauma. For historians, the work remains challenging and essential. The legacy of horror left by Ishii and Unit 731 is not confined to the annals of one nation's past. It is a universal caution against the seduction of progress at the expense of humanity. The growing body of scholarship, grounded in evidence and empathy, ensures that the forgotten victims receive the recognition they deserve, and that those responsible cannot escape the judgment of history. In the end, the legacy of Unit 731 is not one of simple victimization or villainy, but of remembrance, struggle, and the persistent quest to ensure that the darkest chapters of history are never exploited or excused. Through the courage of survivors and the diligence of historians, the shadow cast by Shirō Ishii's enterprise will not succeed in obscuring the light of truth. Chapter 18. The Shadow over Science and Medicine. In the formative decades of the 20th century, science emerged as an instrument of transformation and hope. Within laboratories and academic halls, the boundaries of the possible were being tested. The power of discovery seemed infinite. Yet, in the dark crucible of wartime Japan, a moral abyss yawned. The promise of medicine was perverted, and the profession sworn to heal became a vehicle for unspeakable cruelty. The Japanese Empire, driven by expansionist ambition and a belief in its own racial and cultural superiority, sought not only to dominate its neighbors militarily, but also to harness science in the service of conquest. Medicine, traditionally a sanctuary of compassion, was coopted into a tool for dehumanization and control. It was in this climate, shaped by nationalist fervor and scientific opportunism, that Shirō Ishii would rise. Ishii was not an outlier. He was, in many regards, a product of his era. The Imperial Japanese Army regarded scientific advancement as both a means of ensuring battlefield supremacy and a prerequisite for the state's survival. In this environment, medical research was lavishly funded and ethical boundaries faded into irrelevance. The drive for invention eclipsed the sanctity of human life, especially when those lives belonged to conquered peoples or so-called enemies of the emperor. Unit 731, officially known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, was but a screen for its true function, a secret research unit dedicated to the development of biological and chemical weapons. Hidden away in the remote expanses of Pingfang, near Harbin in Manchukuo, the outpost became an abattoir masquerading as a medical facility. Here, Ishii assembled a team of some of Japan's brightest scientific minds, drawing on their expertise and ambition to forge unprecedented weapons of war. Yet, what transpired within those walls was not simply the cold logic of experimentation. It was a systematic violation and inversion of everything medicine claimed to represent. Thousands of men, women, and children were herded into the compound under the guise of a quarantine facility. In reality, prisoners became test subjects, deprived of all dignity and forced to endure vivisection, deliberate infection with plague and anthrax, and exposure to freezing temperatures and other forms of torture. The rationale underpinning these acts was draped in the language of science. Data, Ishii insisted, had to be gathered from living humans because animal models were insufficient. The victims, derogatorily referred to as maruta or logs, existed solely to further Japan's military goals. The transformation from patient to subject to disposable resource was chillingly complete. The scientific community, while not uniformly complicit, did little to intervene. The pursuit of knowledge, unchecked by ethical oversight, became a justification for ever greater excess. The boundaries between beneficence and malevolence collapsed, opening a void into which all medical responsibility vanished. Internationally, the war years were an era of frantic technological competition, but the secrecy of the Japanese program largely shielded its activities from scrutiny. Within Japan, limited dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. Secrecy pledges and the culture of obedience ensured that most within the orbit of Unit 731 remained silent even after the war's end. With the shroud of secrecy still in place, the shadow cast by Unit 731 and Shirō Ishii stretches into the present day. The events that occurred within the walls of the Pingfang facility continue to challenge the conscience of medical science, posing the unsettling question: what becomes of medicine when divorced from morality? This chapter has sought to illuminate the darkness as starting point in our journey, to confront one of history's greatest betrayals of professional ethics. The story of Shirō Ishii and Unit 731 is not merely a chronicle of one man's ambition, but a cautionary tale about the perils of science unmoored from the values meant to guide it. Chapter 19, Remembering the Forgotten Victims. Unit 731's legacy is inseparable from the lives it destroyed. While Ishii's name is infamous, it is the countless nameless victims, men, women, and children from China, Russia, Korea, and other occupied territories who illuminate the true horror of this episode. These individuals were wrenched from homes and families, swept into the machinery of war, and ultimately rendered invisible by the mechanisms of secrecy and denial. The majority of victims came from northeastern China, where Japanese occupation was marked by brutality. Entire villages were decimated, prisoner populations swelled, and anyone under suspicion was subject to abduction. For many, their first knowledge of Unit 731 would be arrival at the forbidding gates of Pingfang compound, surrounded by high walls, guard towers, and the pervasive suspicion that none who entered would return. Inside, the daily existence of the captives was defined by terror and deprivation. Prisoners were housed in cramped, windowless cells, provided minimal sustenance, and systematically stripped of their identities. To the personnel, these men and women ceased to be individuals, they became logs, catalogued for their perceived scientific usefulness rather than their humanity. Testimonies from former guards, nurses, and, in rare cases, survivors form a mosaic of suffering and degradation. Vivisections were performed without anesthesia, under the guise of understanding organ function and response to disease. Plague-infected fleas were released into communal yards, ensuring that outbreaks would rage unchecked. Frostbite experiments exposed limbs to the Siberian winter. Before reheating techniques, boiling water, friction, or flames were applied while the victim was fully conscious. Women were subjected to forced impregnation, so researchers could study vertical transmission of pathogens. Children, viewed as unique research opportunities by virtue of their physiology, became some of the most vulnerable targets. An unspoken hierarchy of life and death pervaded, dictated by Ishii's evolving research interests and the rhythm of Japan's military campaigns. The fate of the bodies was as grim as the experiments themselves. once life had been extinguished by sepsis, organ failure, or the cumulative toll of endless suffering, the remains were incinerated in large crematoria, erasing physical evidence of the crimes. Records were meticulously kept, yet seldom survived. The post-war purge, the voices of the victims already faint, risk being lost to history altogether. Nevertheless, fragments of memory persist. Oral histories collected by Chinese researchers, testimonies at post-war trials, and whispered family stories bear witness to the immense scale of the atrocities. Survivors, burdened by stigma and fear, rarely spoke openly. Japanese authorities, and later many in the post-war occupation forces, actively discouraged inquiry, seeking to bury the shame of what had transpired. Yet the task of remembrance is non-negotiable. Memorials in Harbin and other affected regions now stand as stark reminders, their halls filled with artifacts salvaged in the aftermath, surgical instruments, photographs, and handwritten notes. International efforts, led by activists and scholars, continue to campaign for broader recognition and restitution for the descendants of victims. The pain wrought by Unit 731 did not cease with liberation. Families were ruptured beyond repair. The psychological trauma of witnessing or suspecting the fate of loved ones lingered for generations. In many respects, the silence imposed after the war was as suffocating as the horrors themselves, a collective refusal to confront the damage inflicted. Remembering the forgotten victims is not merely an act of historical documentation, it is an ethical imperative. Their experiences reveal the true consequences of medical experimentation divorced from compassion and oversight. By honoring their memory, we reaffirm our commitment to human dignity, striving to learn from the darkest moments in order to shape a more just and accountable future. Chapter 20: The Man and the Monster. Shirō Ishii's enduring infamy. The figure of Shirō Ishii straddles the uneasy boundary between genius and monster. A man of formidable intellect, Ishii's early promise as a physician and researcher was unmistakable. Born in 1892 into a family of minor samurai heritage, his fascination with the biological sciences propelled him to study medicine at Kyoto Imperial University, where he quickly distinguished himself for his curiosity, ambition, and autocratic personality. Ishii's ascent mirrored the rise of Japanese militarism, winning favor with senior army leaders. He capitalized on the growing belief that Japan's survival depended on scientific superiority. Charismatic yet commanding, he could inspire loyalty, extracting from his subordinates not only their skill but also their silence. Yet the same qualities that marked him as visionary also catalyzed his descent into infamy. As Unit 731's director, Ishii shaped both method and ideology. His vision for a biological weapons program was radical. He asserted that such weapons would assure Japan of an unassailable edge. To fulfill this vision, every ethical principle was sacrificed. His subordinates, bound by military secrecy and discipline, obeyed. It was Ishii who insisted on live human experimentation, arguing in military briefings that war demanded data unobtainable from animals and that the state's needs superseded all individual rights. He sanitized atrocities behind medical euphemism, referring to his victims as specimens and their torture as procedures. The humans taken into Unit 731's orbit were, in his mind, raw material for national survival. Yet even among his peers, whispers of apprehension circulated. Ishii was ambitious, but also unscrupulous, lax with protocol when it suited him, lavish with resources and unburdened by guilt. He displayed a pragmatic ruthlessness, rewarding and punishing subordinates as he saw fit. His private papers, later seized by the Allies, revealed a chilling single-mindedness and conviction in his own righteousness. The post-war world might have expected justice to catch up with a man of Ishii's notoriety. Instead, he was shielded from prosecution by a secret arrangement with the United States in exchange for the results and records of his experiments. Ishii and many of his associates were granted immunity. Officially, he disappeared, living the rest of his life quietly, practicing medicine, and even operating a private clinic. Never once did he publicly express remorse or testify on behalf of his victims. Ishii's case exemplifies the complexities of justice in the aftermath of total war, the imperative of the emerging Cold War, combined with the allure of unprecedented scientific data, led the victors to prioritize their interests over accountability. The result was not only a personal exoneration, but a wound inflicted upon the cause of international human rights that lingers to this day. His infamy endures, not simply for the scale of his crimes, but for the unsettling questions his life poses. Can brilliance and monstrosity be reconciled within a single person? What happens when the pursuit of knowledge is stripped of all moral foundation? Is forgiveness possible in the face of such profound violation? In confronting the figure of Shirō Ishii, we are forced to grapple with the darkest capabilities of both the individual and the institution. His legacy stands as a harrowing warning that the structures meant to foster life and healing can, under the wrong stewardship, be turned to serve the machinery of destruction. The moral shadow he cast continues to haunt medicine, law, and memory, like a testament to the enduring consequences when ethics are eclipsed by ambition and convenience.